There was something sacred about the cabin, a quiet refuge tucked deep in the pine-covered hills, far away from city noise and neighborhood politics. It wasn't much to look at from the outside: rough timber walls, a slanted metal roof, and a porch swing that creaked whenever the wind shifted. But for the man who owned it, the cabin was more than a getaway. It was a reminder of simpler times. For years, it had stood untouched, perched at the edge of a forgotten logging trail. A narrow dirt path wound through the woods, leading to a small clearing that opened onto the cabin's front porch. Birds sang in the branches, and the lake beyond shimmered like glass. There were no rules here, no committees, no notices pinned to doors, just peace. That peace began to fracture when the expansion came. Developers, hungry for mountain views and quiet escapes, began carving lots into the forest. They built luxury cabins with polished decks and spotless driveways, complete with matching mailboxes and imported landscaping. With them came something else, an HOA. At first it was harmless. A few notices about road maintenance, a friendly welcome letter. But the man didn't live in their subdivision. His cabin predated their existence. Still, that didn't stop them from trying to fold him into their little kingdom. The letters started mild, printed on glossy paper with a logo at the top. "Welcome to the Evergreen Ridge community." They listed rules and standards, urging all property owners to preserve the beauty and harmony of the neighborhood. He ignored them. His cabin sat outside their boundary, miles from their carefully trimmed cul-de-sacs. The woods between them were not shared land. They were wild, untouched, and free. But to the HOA president, a woman known among locals as Karen, boundaries were suggestions, not limits. Her own home sat at the highest point in the new development, overlooking the valley like a watchtower. From her porch, she could glimpse the faint outline of the cabin in the trees. To her, it was an eyesore, a relic of a past that didn't fit her vision of perfection. Soon, the letters grew less friendly. They were no longer printed in color. They were formal, typed in stern black font, citing sections of community policy and visual consistency standards. Then came threats of fines, followed by demands for property inspection. The man had seen people like her before, those who mistook control for order, who thought beauty could be legislated and nature tamed. He didn't respond. The cabin had stood before her HOA existed, and it would stand long after it was gone. That silence only provoked her further. Karen's obsession with the cabin deepened. She started attending meetings with printed photos, blurry zoom-ins taken from the ridge, claiming the cabin was bringing down property values and violating HOA aesthetics. Her board members nodded, though most of them had never seen it in person. When the letters went unanswered, she escalated. She began referring to the cabin as abandoned property in community posts, hinting that it might be unsafe or harboring trespassers. Neighbors whispered, curious. Some hiked up the old trail just to glimpse it, only to be met with the sight of a sturdy cabin and the hum of wind through pine needles. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She wanted action, and action in her mind meant authority. That was when she created the Evergreen Ridge Security Committee, a self-appointed patrol made up of a few local volunteers in reflective vests and walkie-talkies. They called themselves HOA Security. Their mission was simple: to maintain safety and enforce community standards. Most residents laughed it off, but Karen didn't. She gave them maps, directions, and orders. She told them to check on the cabin in the woods, to make sure it complied with community codes. And so, one Saturday morning, the sound of engines echoed faintly through the forest. A pair of off-road utility vehicles rolled down the old logging trail, their tires crunching over fallen pine cones. Inside, two men in vests clutched clipboards, squinting through the trees for signs of life. They thought they were performing a harmless inspection, but as the trail narrowed and the shadows deepened, doubt began to creep in. The cabin wasn't like the houses below. It felt different, older. There was a stillness here, a weight in the air that warned them they didn't belong. When they finally broke through the clearing, they saw it, the cabin standing silent, half in shadow. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was home. One of them hesitated, glancing at the other. This wasn't what they'd expected. Karen had said the place was empty, unsafe. Yet here it stood, solid and alive. Before they could decide what to do, the door creaked open. A figure stepped onto the porch, calm and steady. No words were exchanged, no gestures made, just silence, the kind that carried warning in its weight. The security men froze. Something about the moment unsettled them. The man's expression wasn't angry. It was measured, like someone assessing a threat. The forest seemed to grow quieter. Even the wind paused. The men took a cautious step back, mumbling to each other. The clipboard trembled slightly in one man's hand. Then, without a word, they turned their vehicles around and started back down the trail. The man watched them leave, the engines fading into the distance. He knew this wasn't over. Karen wouldn't stop. Not after being ignored, not after being defied. She'd send more next time. He sighed and stepped off the porch, looking toward the road that wound through the trees. He knew what was coming. But he also knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. Because tomorrow, his cousins were coming up for the weekend. Men who had served overseas, brothers in arms, bound by loyalty and blood. They were bringing their Harleys. And the woods, once quiet, would soon rumble with the sound of engines far louder than any HOA patrol could imagine. The morning came quietly with mist rising through the pines and the scent of wet earth drifting across the clearing. Dew glistened on the porch rail as the cabin owner sipped his coffee, his eyes fixed on the trail that led down toward the valley. The forest was still, save for the occasional cry of a hawk or the faint rustle of a squirrel. It was peaceful, almost deceptively so. He had lived here long enough to recognize when calm was a warning, not a comfort. The visit from the so-called HOA security had changed something. The forest had absorbed their intrusion, but it hadn't forgotten, and neither had he. Word traveled fast in small communities. By the time the sun rose over the ridge, whispers had already reached Karen's ears. Her patrol had returned shaken, their voices uncertain, their stories thin and conflicting. One claimed the cabin was occupied. Another said the man was armed. A third insisted he had military connections. Karen dismissed their fear as exaggeration. She saw it as weakness, proof that only she had the resolve to uphold community standards. She had built her identity around control, and she refused to let one stubborn outsider threaten it. By mid-morning, she was on the phone, rallying her committee once again. This time, they wouldn't just observe. They would enforce. Down in the valley, HOA notices began circulating online. The message was sharp, bordering on unhinged. The cabin was a safety hazard, unauthorized, and subject to removal. Karen framed her mission as one of community protection, spinning the narrative to paint herself as the defender of order against a rogue squatter. Few believed her, but none dared confront her directly. Back at the cabin, the man moved with quiet purpose. He wasn't angry. Anger clouded judgment. He simply understood that confrontation was coming, and when it did, he needed to be ready. He stacked firewood, secured tools, and checked the trail cameras hidden along the tree line. By noon, he heard it, a low, distant rumble, not the steady, familiar growl of Harley engines, but the uneven sputter of ATVs. The security team was back. They came in deeper this time, 5 of them, dressed in reflective vests and cheap tactical gloves. Clipboards had been replaced by walkie-talkies. They carried themselves with borrowed authority, puffed up by Karen's encouragement. When they reached the clearing, they slowed, their bravado thinning as the cabin came into view once more. The smoke from the chimney curled lazily through the treetops, a silent reminder that this place was not abandoned. The man stood at the edge of the porch, hands at his sides, still and composed. He didn't need to move. The forest itself seemed to stand with him. The security men hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Their training consisted of neighborhood watch meetings, not confrontations in the wilderness. They called out, but their voices wavered. The man didn't respond. He simply watched, his silence louder than any warning. The weight of the woods pressed in around them. The whisper of the wind, the creak of the trees, the unseen rustle of small animals shifting in the brush. One of them took a step forward. Another followed. But before they could reach the porch, a new sound cut through the silence. It started low, a distant hum, like thunder rolling over the hills. Then it grew, louder, closer, heavier. Engines. Not the light, nervous buzz of off-road vehicles, but deep, roaring V-twin engines that shook the ground. The men froze. Their eyes darted toward the trail behind them. Through the mist, faint shapes emerged, dark, broad silhouettes glinting with chrome and leather. The forest seemed to open before them as the sound filled the clearing. Then they appeared. 3 motorcycles broke through the tree line, tires crunching over roots and gravel, headlights cutting through the haze. On them rode men built like walls, broad-shouldered, steady-handed, wearing black jackets marked with military patches and weathered insignias. Their eyes were hidden behind mirrored shades, their expressions unreadable. The man on the porch didn't move. He didn't need to. His cousins had arrived. The security volunteers stared in disbelief. They hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for it. Karen had told them the man was just a recluse, some stubborn hermit with no connections. No one mentioned veterans, no one mentioned soldiers. The Harleys idled to a stop in front of the porch, engines rumbling like distant artillery. The cousins dismounted in silence, their boots heavy on the dirt. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Their presence alone shifted the air. Calm but unyielding, the kind of calm born from years of discipline and danger. The lead security man swallowed hard. His vest suddenly felt ridiculous. The clipboard back in his vehicle seemed absurd. He glanced at his team, wide eyes, pale faces, uncertain footing. The forest waited. Then, slowly, one of them backed away. Another followed. Within moments, the so-called enforcers were retreating down the trail, stumbling over roots and whispering frantically into their radios. The roar of the Harleys filled the silence they left behind, steady and unrelenting. Karen was waiting at the ridge, binoculars in hand, expecting triumph. What she saw instead made her blood run cold. Her security team emerged from the trees pale and shaken, speaking over each other, their voices trembling. They told her what they'd seen. The men, the bikes, the look in their eyes. Karen's confidence faltered for the first time. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself it was coincidence. But deep down, she knew she had picked the wrong fight. Back at the cabin, the cousins laughed quietly as they parked their bikes under the trees. The man simply nodded, his expression calm. There was no gloating, no bravado. Just understanding. The message had been sent, but Karen wasn't one to back down. Not yet. Her pride, once pricked, became a wound she couldn't ignore. And in that wound, anger festered. The next move, she decided, would be hers. The next morning dawned bright and cold, sunlight filtering through a haze of mountain mist. From the porch, the forest looked peaceful again, calm, almost innocent. But beneath that quiet surface, something was shifting. The air carried a tension that hadn't been there before. A low hum of anticipation that seemed to settle in the needles of every pine. Inside her hilltop home, Karen was seething. Her reflection in the mirror looked sharp, almost brittle, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. She had spent years building authority within the Evergreen Ridge community, years crafting her image as the unwavering guardian of standards. And now, in her mind, it was all under attack. Not by vandals or trespassers, but by one man in a cabin who refused to bow to her will. The reports from her security team replayed in her mind. She had sent them to enforce, to show presence and control. Instead, they had returned shaken, their pride crumbling beneath stories of roaring engines and men in military jackets. Karen told herself they were exaggerating, that the so-called veterans were bluffing. Still, their fear infected her thoughts, gnawing at her confidence. She couldn't allow that. To maintain order, she needed to strike back, decisively. So with a steady hand, she reached for her phone. The sheriff's office had heard from her before. Overgrown hedges, noisy dogs, suspicious vehicles. Nothing was too small for her to report. But this time, she claimed it was serious. She spun her story carefully, dressing it in the language of concern and community safety. There was a hostile individual living near the subdivision, she said, possibly armed, possibly running an illegal residence. The deputy on the other end listened politely, though the skepticism in his voice was hard to miss. They'd heard of her before, too, but when she insisted the man had military connections and was intimidating residents, they agreed to send someone up the mountain, just to take a look. By early afternoon, the sound of tires crunching over gravel echoed faintly through the trees. A county SUV rolled slowly up the winding path, sunlight flashing off its roof lights. Inside sat a young deputy, calm and cautious, following the coordinates Karen had provided. The cabin came into view through a curtain of trees. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and the faint scent of pine mixed with wood fire hung in the air. To the deputy, it looked peaceful, not the hostile camp he'd been led to expect. He parked a few yards from the clearing, stepping out with practiced ease. The cabin door stood open, the man visible on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand. There was no tension in his stance, no aggression, just watchfulness. The deputy introduced himself, his tone respectful but firm. He'd heard both sides, Karen's frantic complaints and the quiet reality of what stood before him. Within minutes, it was clear this wasn't a man hiding from anything. His property was deeded, surveyed, and entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. The cabin had stood long before Evergreen Ridge even existed. The deputy's report would reflect that. Back down in the valley, Karen waited anxiously by her window, binoculars resting on the sill. When the SUV finally emerged from the tree line, her heart leapt, until she saw the deputy's calm expression. No urgency, no backup, no handcuffs. He drove past her street without stopping, her lips pressed thin. The sheriff wasn't taking her side. The law, it seemed, wasn't on her side either. That realization stung deeper than she expected. For a moment, she considered letting it go, accepting that the cabin was beyond her reach. But pride, once wounded, rarely heals cleanly. Instead, it festers, turning reason into obsession. By evening, she was back at her desk, typing furiously. If the county wouldn't intervene, she'd make it a community issue. She drafted posts for the HOA bulletin, warning residents of a militia presence near the boundary line. She framed the cabin as a threat, a potential danger to families and children. It was manipulation through fear, and she knew it would work. Within hours, comments began trickling in. Some residents expressed concern, others skepticism. A few defended the cabin owner, pointing out that he had never caused trouble. But most stayed silent, waiting for someone else to decide what was true. Meanwhile, up in the hills, the man and his cousins remained unaware of the storm brewing below. The Harleys rested beside the porch, chrome glinting under the moonlight. The men sat by the fire pit, the glow reflecting in their calm, steady eyes. They had seen conflict before, real conflict, and they recognized the pattern now. This wasn't about land or law. It was about control. And people like Karen, once challenged, rarely stopped until they destroyed themselves. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, a soft wind swept through the forest, carrying whispers of movement below. Lights flickered faintly between the trees, flashlights perhaps. Voices murmured, uncertain but present. The cousins exchanged glances. It wasn't the sheriff this time. It was something else, something organized but nervous. Karen, furious at the lack of official support, had decided to act alone. With a handful of loyal volunteers, she had formed an emergency response patrol, another version of her security group, this time claiming to defend property values. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and bravado, they began their slow, uneasy climb toward the ridge. In her mind, this was a mission of justice. To everyone else, it was a march into unknown territory. The cabin lights flickered off. The clearing grew still. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and from the shadows, the low growl of an engine broke the silence. One Harley, then another, then a third, rumbling to life with the deep, steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Karen's volunteers froze, their flashlights shaking as they swept across the darkened trail. The sound grew louder, closer, unmistakable. They had come prepared to confront a man. Instead, they had stepped into the camp of soldiers. The mountain would remember what happened next. Night fell heavy over the pines. The moon, a pale shard above the ridge, cast long shadows across the forest floor. Mist coiled through the underbrush, curling around roots and rocks like breath from something ancient and unseen. In the distance, faint lights flickered, flashlights held by trembling hands, weaving through darkness they did not understand. The mountain was silent at first. Even the wind seemed to still itself, waiting. Then came the sound, low, steady, rising from the depths of the woods like thunder rolling up from the earth. One engine, then two, then three. The unmistakable roar of Harley-Davidson motorcycles breaking the silence of the hills. Karen's so-called emergency patrol froze mid-step. Their flashlights jittered as fear rippled through them. They had come up the trail expecting another quiet confrontation, perhaps a stern talk, perhaps a warning. What they found instead was something far older and far stronger than the petty power of a homeowners association. The engines grew louder, closer, echoing off the trees and shaking the ground. The vibrations carried through the soil, up through their boots, into their bones. The flashlights swung wildly, scattering across trunks and branches as panic began to take root. Then, from the clearing ahead, 3 headlights flared to life, beams cutting through mist, blinding in the dark. The bikes stood still at first, engines idling low, a sound that was not just noise but presence. Behind them, the cabin loomed, silent, unmoving, yet very much alive. Karen's volunteers didn't speak. Their breath came quick and shallow. Somewhere behind them, one muttered something about calling the sheriff again. Another suggested turning back, but Karen wasn't there. She had stayed behind, sending others to do what she wouldn't risk herself. The man from the cabin stood at the edge of the porch, hands at his sides. The light caught the outline of his face, calm, unreadable. The cousins sat astride their bikes, helmets reflecting the moonlight, their shoulders squared and still. They didn't advance. They didn't need to. Their silence was command enough. The patrol members fidgeted. The air felt heavier with every heartbeat. The forest, once familiar, now felt vast and wild, indifferent to suburban rules and neighborhood hierarchies. They were out of their depth, far from cul-de-sacs and covenants. The first man turned back, muttering about not getting paid for this. Another followed, stumbling over a root as he retreated. Soon the group began to thin, flashlights disappearing one by one into the darkness of the trail. The engines continued their slow, rhythmic growl, steady as the pulse of the land itself. Within minutes, the patrol was gone. The mountain reclaimed its silence. Only the faint echo of their retreating footsteps remained, swallowed by the night. Up in her home overlooking the ridge, Karen waited by her window, staring into the darkness. She had expected a message from her team, perhaps even a triumphant photo of the cabin under inspection. But her phone stayed silent. The radio on her desk crackled once, then went dead. She told herself they were just out of range, that they would return soon with a report. But as the minutes stretched into hours, unease crept in. Somewhere beyond the ridge, faint and distant, she thought she heard the echo of engines, a sound that made her heart tighten. Down in the valley, whispers spread through the community like wind through dry grass. Some said the cabin man wasn't alone. Others claimed he had turned the mountain into a fortress. A few even insisted they'd seen figures watching from the tree line at dusk, silent and unmoving. Rumor became story, and story became fear. For the first time, residents began questioning Karen's authority. Her leadership, once firm, now looked reckless. What began as a campaign for community harmony had turned into a series of confrontations that brought only embarrassment and tension. But Karen couldn't admit defeat. Her pride was too deeply rooted, her sense of control too fragile to let go. She convinced herself she had been sabotaged, that the patrol failed because they were weak, not because she was wrong. And so, she began to plan again. Back at the cabin, the night grew still once more. The Harleys cooled quietly beside the porch, their chrome faintly reflecting the starlight. The cousins sat together by the fire pit, the orange glow flickering against their faces. They didn't celebrate. They didn't gloat. They knew how these things worked. How people like Karen never stopped until someone made them. The man stared into the flames, his mind steady. He understood now that this wasn't just about the cabin. It was about the illusion of control that had grown like ivy across the valley. An illusion that couldn't tolerate anything wild or ungoverned. The cabin, the woods, even the silence itself. They all stood as reminders that not everything could be owned, measured, or fined. As the fire crackled, one of the cousins glanced toward the ridge, where faint house lights shimmered through the trees. They knew Karen was watching. Not with her eyes, perhaps, but with her ego. And she would not rest easy after what had happened tonight. The man rose slowly, walking to the edge of the clearing. The mist had thinned, revealing the trail winding back toward the valley. He could almost see the path ahead, not just of dirt and rock, but of conflict yet to come. He knew the sheriff would return, not out of malice, but duty. Karen would make sure of it. She'd flood the county office with complaints, twist every story, frame every moment as threat. And when that didn't work, she'd go higher, to county boards, to news outlets, to anyone who would listen. But the man wasn't afraid. The mountain had weathered storms before, and so had he. He turned back toward the cabin, the light from the fire warming the dark. Behind him, the cousins remained watchful. Men forged in battle, now standing guard not over war zones, but over a simple patch of forest and a man's right to peace. The engines would remain silent tonight, but their memory would linger, in the minds of those who heard them, in the whispers of those who fled, and in the growing doubt that began to crack the perfect facade of Evergreen Ridge. And as dawn approached, one truth settled over the mountain like fog. Karen had started something she could no longer control. The night belonged to the cabin now. Morning crept over Evergreen Ridge with a quiet that felt uneasy. The mist that had once blanketed the forest was thinner now, yet it carried the weight of unease, a kind of silence that came after something had shifted. In the valley below, the community awoke to rumors swirling faster than the morning breeze. The HOA patrol hadn't returned as expected. No official report was filed. And those who had joined the expedition remained strangely silent, unwilling to speak about what they had seen on that mountain road. Karen, however, was far from silent. Her pride had been wounded, not just by the failure of her so-called security patrol, but by the growing whispers of defiance among the neighbors. For years, she had been the voice of authority, the one who decided what colors homes could be, how lawns must be trimmed, what belonged and what didn't. She saw herself as the guardian of perfection, the keeper of order. But now, After the events of that night, her authority had begun to crack. The HOA board, once obedient, began questioning her judgment. Some members suggested leaving the cabin man alone. Others warned of legal consequences if they continued to harass him, but Karen dismissed them all. To her, this wasn't just a matter of rules. It was about principle. The man in the cabin had defied her. He had made her look weak, and in Karen's mind, weakness was unforgivable. So she decided to escalate. She drafted a new violation notice, thicker than the last, filled with every possible infraction she could invent, from visual disruption to unauthorized structure. She included photos taken from afar, printed in grayscale, as if evidence of wrongdoing. Then she filed an official complaint with the county, claiming the cabin was an unpermitted dwelling. But Karen didn't stop there. She reached out to a local journalist, spinning a tale of a dangerous recluse, occupying HOA land, intimidating neighbors, and harboring unlicensed vehicles in the woods. It was a story laced with half-truths and wild exaggerations, crafted to stir attention. And attention it did stir. By the week's end, a news van rolled into Evergreen Ridge. Cameras turned toward the forest, microphones poised, reporters eager for a story that mixed danger, mystery, and community conflict. Karen stood at the forefront, polished and poised, presenting herself as the victim of a defiant outsider. But what she didn't know was that others had seen differently. The patrol members who fled that night had begun talking, not to her but among themselves, and to others in the neighborhood. They spoke in hushed tones of engines in the dark, of figures who didn't move yet commanded presence, of how the forest itself seemed to close around them when they tried to advance. Word spread that the man in the cabin wasn't violent, just protective, that the HOA had crossed a line no one else dared to. The sheriff, weary of the ongoing complaints, decided to visit the mountain himself, not as an enforcer, but as a mediator. He knew the man in the cabin. Years back, they had shared a drink at a veterans gathering, talking about quiet places and the peace found in solitude. The sheriff understood something Karen never could, that some men didn't seek control. They simply sought silence. When the sheriff arrived at the cabin, he found no threat, no hostility, just the man, calm and steady, tending to his porch. The Harleys sat parked, their engines quiet, their chrome catching morning light. The cousins were gone for now, having returned to their own paths, but their presence lingered, not in sight, but in spirit. The sheriff listened as the man told his side, the constant notices, the trespassing, the intrusion into his space. And then he looked out toward the lake, the one that shimmered behind the cabin like glass. Its surface reflected the sky, untouched and pure. The sheriff understood immediately. This wasn't a criminal. This was a man who had simply chosen peace over noise. Back in the valley, Karen waited impatiently. She expected an arrest, a confrontation, something that would restore her image. Instead, the sheriff returned alone, his expression unreadable. He issued no citations. He filed no charges. And when neighbors asked what had happened, he simply said, "There's no problem up there." That single sentence spread like wildfire. Karen's influence, once absolute, began to unravel. Board members distanced themselves. Homeowners stopped attending her meetings. Some even began removing their HOA-approved decor, quietly reclaiming their individuality. The very control Karen had built her identity upon slipped through her fingers, grain by grain. In desperation, she stormed back to the ridge one final time. Alone this time. No volunteers, no backup. Just her car, her clipboard, and her pride. She drove up the winding dirt road, branches scraping her windows, the tires crunching against gravel. The forest closed around her, whispering with each gust of wind. When she reached the clearing, the cabin stood silent as before. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Birds perched along the porch rail, unbothered. There was no sign of confrontation, no sound but the rustle of leaves. She stepped out, clutching her clipboard as though it were armor. The silence pressed in. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against bark. The mountain air felt heavier than she remembered, not hostile, but ancient, as if watching. For the first time, Karen hesitated. She realized how far she had come, not just in distance, but in obsession. Her crusade, once painted as righteousness, now felt hollow. The cabin hadn't broken the community. Her own pride had. A breeze passed through, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and smoke. It rustled the papers on her clipboard, scattering a few across the dirt. She reached for them, but the wind took them further, tumbling down the trail, disappearing into the trees. In that moment, something inside her broke. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, like the final crack in glass before it gives way. She stood there for a long while, staring at the cabin, then turned back toward her car. By the time she reached the valley again, something had changed. The neighbors no longer looked to her for guidance. The board quietly dissolved within weeks. Without Karen's iron grip, Evergreen Ridge began to breathe again. Yards grew a little wilder. Laughter replaced stiff politeness, and the woods beyond were left in peace. The man in the cabin watched from afar as the world below softened. He never sought revenge, only balance. And now, as the days grew warmer, that balance had returned. The mountain remained, steadfast, unmoved by pride or policy. But somewhere deep in its heart, a small ember of defiance glowed, a reminder that even the most powerful voices fall silent when faced with truth. Seasons changed slowly in Evergreen Ridge. What was once a landscape of strict perfection, trimmed hedges, synchronized mailboxes, and rule-bound smiles, began to loosen, breathe, and live again. Nature reclaimed the edges of manicured lawns, wildflowers pushed through gravel paths, and laughter replaced complaint. It had been months since Karen's final drive up the mountain. No one had seen her much since that day. Her house, once the centerpiece of the neighborhood, spotless, symmetrical, a shrine to control, now stood quieter. Curtains drawn, lawn uncut. The world she'd built through fear and authority had simply let go of her, like branches shrugging off the last dead leaf. Without Karen's voice dictating every color, every rule, Evergreen Ridge found its rhythm again. Children rode bikes down streets once forbidden for noise violations. Neighbors greeted each other not out of obligation, but out of genuine kindness. Even the HOA board, once her private council, officially dissolved. No meetings, no memos, no fines, just community. And at the edge of it all, high in the forest above, the cabin remained. The man lived quietly, as he always had. He split wood in the mornings, fished at dawn, watched mist rise off the lake like smoke from another world. The stillness suited him, a life not of defiance, but of balance. He had never asked for war, only peace. Yet when conflict came, the mountain itself seemed to rise with him. The scars of that battle, though unseen, lingered. Not in anger, but as a lesson carved into the valley's memory. The people of Evergreen Ridge learned that rules meant nothing when they lost their humanity. That power, when wielded without understanding, always collapses under its own weight. Karen had tried to turn the mountain into a monument to control. Instead, it became a reminder of humility. From time to time, hikers would pass near the cabin trail. They'd notice the lake shimmering between the trees, a mirror to the sky, and the faint smoke curling from a distant chimney. Some said they saw a man there, calm and steady, always working, always watching. Others heard the low echo of engines, though no bikes were ever seen, as if the memory of that night still whispered through the pines. Those who listened closely claimed they could hear the faint rumble of Harleys far beyond the valley, carried on the wind. A ghostly reminder of what happens when arrogance meets resolve. Karen eventually sold her home, quietly, without ceremony. She moved to another town, another neighborhood, perhaps one where no one knew her name, where she could start again without the weight of reputation. Maybe, in her solitude, she began to understand the cost of her pride. Maybe not, but Evergreen Ridge did not wait for her. It healed. The man in the cabin watched the seasons turn. Snow blanketed the ridge in winter, muffling every sound until the world felt held in stillness. In spring, thawing streams carried new life down the slopes, feeding the same lake that reflected his porch light each night. By summer, the forest was alive again. Birdsong, crickets, wind through the evergreens. He had not spoken to many in the valley since the confrontation. He didn't need to. Some lessons didn't require words. His presence alone, steady, unwavering, became its own story. When the sheriff made his annual rounds, he sometimes stopped by the cabin. They'd share a quiet cup of coffee on the porch, watching mist curl off the water. The sheriff never mentioned Karen or the HOA. He didn't need to. The past was buried in the soil now, beneath roots and moss and time. And every now and then, when the sun dipped low and the forest filled with gold, the man would hear it, faint but unmistakable. The low, distant rumble of motorcycles on a faraway road. It brought a small smile to his face, a reminder that family didn't always mean proximity. Some bonds were forged in silence, tested by conflict, and made stronger by understanding. Down below, Evergreen Ridge had changed forever. The new community that grew in place of the old one learned to live without constant oversight. They began holding potlucks instead of hearings, gardening together instead of arguing over fences. The same people who once feared fines now shared tools and stories. And though no one said it aloud, many credited the cabin man for the transformation. He had become something of a local legend, the man on the mountain who stood against the HOA and taught the valley humility. His story passed from porch to porch, from parent to child, until it became almost myth. Some exaggerated it, of course, saying he single-handedly faced an entire army of HOA enforcers, or that he lived with wolves who guarded his home. Others claimed his cousin still rode through the forest at night, keeping watch. But those who truly knew the truth was simpler. A man who wanted to be left alone, and a community that learned what happens when they push too far. One evening, as twilight settled over the lake, the man sat on his porch watching the light fade. The water shimmered like glass, catching the last ember of the sun. He listened to the forest, every chirp, every rustle, and felt something deep, wordless, and true. Peace. Not the kind that came from winning or forcing silence, but the kind earned through endurance, through standing firm when others sought control, through patience when others brought noise. Below, Evergreen Ridge glowed softly, porch lights flickering like stars among trees. Life went on. Children laughed, dogs barked, neighbors waved. The world, at last, was no longer afraid. And up on the ridge, the man leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. The mountain breathed with him. The engines were silent now. But their echo remained, not as threat, but as memory. A heartbeat of strength that reminded the world, peace, when protected, is power. The HOA was gone. Karen was gone. The rules had vanished, but the cabin remained, unmoved, unbroken, unbothered. And in that stillness, that final, sacred quiet, the story ended not with triumph, nor with defeat, but with something far greater. Freedom.